Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. My name's Hugh Fullerton.
My name is Morgan Jeffrey.
And this week we're delving back in time for a school reunion. I mean, in Doctor Who you're often delving back in time, but today we're specifically delving 14 years back in time on the very day that this podcast is going live to the 2006 episode, which is called, you guessed it, School Reunion, which saw the 10th Doctor and Rose reunite, or unite in Rose's case, with Elisabeth Sladen, Sarah Jane Smith, companion of the third and fourth Doctors, and K9, obviously. And yeah, they battle Anthony Head and the Bat People, the Krillitane, to stop them becoming gods in a school. There's quite a lot going on in the episode, is basically the short thing. But yeah, I don't know, we sort of thought this was a fun time to revisit that, because there's also been some other stuff related to Sarah Jane come out recently, which we'll touch on in a bit. But yeah, I mean, Morgan, it's a while back, but I mean, bringing Sarah Jane back to Doctor Who is, you know, I mean, what do you, obviously in hindsight we can say, oh, what a great idea, they got this whole TV spin-off for Sarah Jane Adventures out of it. But, you know, at the time, do you think it was a bit of a risk?
I certainly felt like it was a risk at the time. I remember, I think before it was officially announced, and there were rumours doing the rounds that Sarah Jane was going to come back and K9 as well. And obviously we just had the first series of Doctor Who with Christopher Eccleston and Billie Piper. It was this very successful, very modern relaunch. And then there were these rumours circling Series 2 that they were going to bring back a classic companion and K9. And I thought, first of all, well, there's no way they'll go that route. And I thought if they did go that route, it might be a mistake, because the show had so successfully relaunched, and it felt fresh, and it had kind of performed above and beyond anyone's expectations. And then I thought to bring in elements from the past might be a mistake. Clearly, I massively underestimated the Doctor Who production team at the time, because I think it could have been mishandled, and it could have felt like the show relying on its past at a time when it really did need to look to the future. But the way in which it's handled, I think, absolutely justifies it.
I think it's really clever. I mean, they bring Sarah Jane back basically as, like Mickey says, the ex. You know, if Rose is the Doctor's girlfriend, which is kind of how the series was presenting it at the time, then, you know, what is Sarah Jane except an ex-girlfriend, you know, who a blast from the past. And it's kind of like quite a clever way of examining the way Doctor Who has this Doctor-companion relationship. The thing Sarah keeps on saying is, when you have that kind of intense relationship with somebody, when you have a relationship with the Doctor, and it's interesting because it wasn't really romantic with, you know, Sarah and the Doctor in the classic series, not explicitly, but obviously it is much more romantic with David Tennant and Rose. And I think it's just a really clever way of explaining it, because if you're watching it, you didn't know who Sarah Jane was, you'd get it. You'd be like, oh yeah, but she right, the Doctor's had companions before. That makes sense. Like, everyone has exes. And like, he has basically an ex-companion. And I think it helps Elisabeth Sladen, you know, despite, 30 years on from when she was regularly on the series, she looks pretty much the same.
Yeah.
You know, like it kind of works for everybody. I think it works for the fans of the classic series who are really happy to see Sarah Jane back. But for people coming to it fresh, it's like you immediately understand where she fits in the framework, but in a way that doesn't contradict where she actually fits in, you know, the Doctor Who canon. I think it's really cleverly done. Like you say, it could have been kind of self-indulgent, but I think it works really well.
And we shouldn't forget either that this story is the first of the modern series to really acknowledge that the Doctor has a past at all, or that he even had companions before Rose. You know, we were talking in the last podcast about firsts in NuWho, Human Nature, Family of Blood being the first time we see images of the previous Doctors in John Smith's Journal of Impossible Things. But this is the first time that we acknowledge that he's had relationships with other people, that he's had other travelling companions. It's really technically the first time we know for certain that this is a continuation, not even a reboot of the classic series. I thought you meant that it's a pattern of behaviour. Yeah, it's Doctor falling back into old habits. But also, it's the first story ever, really, to, as you say, explore the impact that travelling with the Doctor has on a companion, and that it has on him, and why he sometimes leaves people behind, and why he doesn't go back for them, which is particularly relevant in Sarah Jane's case, because her original departure is slightly odd in that the Doctor is called to Gallifrey, and he says, oh, no humans can set foot on Gallifrey, I must leave you on Earth. Well, fine, but just come back for her later.
Yeah, pick her up later. Pick her up. You pick her up later, pal. Like, just sort her out.
And at the time, that's maybe just a bit of a fudge. But it's kind of reframed here in this idea that the doctor will live forever and his companions won't. So he can't stay with them for too long. So he abandons them. You know, it's cruel to be kind in a way. So he left Sarah Jane behind on purpose, but she didn't know that was coming, and she maybe thought he was going to come back. And so there's a lot going on there.
There is. I mean, it's a big theme of these first few years of NuWho is what happens to the people who don't travel with the Doctor? What happens to people who get left behind? Like, you have that a little bit in this episode with Mickey worrying that he's the tin dog, which I remember as a joke that actually my dad isn't a big Doctor Who fan, but he watched that episode and he always referred to Noel Clarke as the tin dog guy throughout the series. But I think you see it also with Jackie, and you know, when Rose appears to go missing for a year. And I think actually it's one of the sort of challenging things, because obviously as a TV production, Doctor Who, the cast changes. For the Doctor, that's easy. The Doctor's face changes, the Doctor changes. The thing is, for the companions, obviously actors want to move on, but in real life, why would those characters, you know, want to stop? Which is why I think we have a trend in the modern series for them to be like horribly killed in a way that isn't really being horribly killed. Do you know what I mean? Like they're sent off to travel the universe, or they're turned into a water monster, or, you know, they have their memory wiped, all this stuff.
Well, there's only 3 ways to do it, really, which is either they die, which is the least taken route usually, or they leave the Doctor, or the Doctor leaves them. Those are sort of, and more often than not, the show goes the route of they leave the Doctor because it feels like the characters sort of, I don't know, moved beyond him. I think there's a line in, is it Amy's Choice, where the Dream Lord says something along the lines of they grow up and they leave you. So yeah, and this explores the different ways in which companions can leave the Doctor, whether or not he leaves them behind, and as you say, what happens to them afterwards when it's not their choice.
I mean, it dovetails quite nicely with what the Krillitaine are up to, where Sarah Jane says at the end, you know, this is the universe. You need the pain and the difficulty. You know, the universe has to keep moving forward. That's the way. That's what gives life meaning. Is, you know, blah blah blah. It's funny though. I was thinking in that bit where Rose is like slightly horrified to learn that he's travelled with other people, and I was like, I mean, Rose, if you only knew, like, if you like, at this point, he's like, what? There was someone else you travelled with? And he's like, yeah, just this one, just
one
this,
other,
yeah, just not like loads of robots and aliens and
there is
people.
There is a mini-sode. I can't recall the name of it right now, but there's one where Clara's in the TARDIS and sort of looking through the TARDIS databanks and looking back at all the Doctor's old companions, and it's like, how many women has he had in here?
That is great. That's very Stephen Moffat, isn't it? Just to sort of pull that out. But no, yeah, it's a really interesting thing in the episode, like, to discover. And I think, you know, it's kind of amazing that we don't, you know, we do still want to see so much of the old companions. We don't want to see the back of them. You know, we do always want to hear what they're up to. And I think, like, it's really cool that Elisabeth Sladen got such a second, you know, wind as Sarah Jane out of this episode, essentially. You know, she got the whole spin-off series and appeared, you know, multiple times in the series. It did, whenever she turned up, though, it did make me think, you know, I know they got Joe Grant to turn up in the Sarah Jane Adventures at one point, but I was a bit like, why doesn't he call, if he's calling Sarah Jane, why doesn't he call anyone else? Like,
well,
when it was just modern series people, it's like, well, he's probably forgotten the numbers, you know.
I think Sarah Jane was the fan favourite, who that sort of got retconned into that she was the Doctor's favourite.
Sure.
Where if you look back at the classic series, the Doctor has this close relationship with Sarah Jane, but arguably no more than he has with many of his other companions. But because Elisabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane was particularly popular with fans, it's then established that she had a closer than usual relationship with the Doctor, whatever that means.
Yeah, and I think because it's clever, because it's one of those things that is a stretch, but because we talked about this in our canon episode, if people like it, and because people like her, they're like, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, exactly. No one's going to object to Sarah Jane being the Doctor's favourite because she was our favourite for the most part, right?
Exactly. Here's a slightly random thought, by the way. I was thinking about this episode, and I was sort of thinking, God, must have been so crazy getting, you know, Sarah Jane to turn up. Blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, it's not the same, but I think the equivalent now would be like Rose traveling with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor. Like, it's not the same because it's not such a long gap. But in terms of like thinking of eras, and I thought about it, and I was like, is John Barrowman turning up in, you know, Fugitive of the Jadoon? Is that similar? Like, it's sort of, I know it's different, but it is like a previous Doctor's companion turning up not in a multi-Doctor episode to like,
Mm.
work alongside a future Doctor. Like that isn't that common, is it? It's quite an unusual sort of setup.
No, I think when we were watching this episode at the time in 2006, the classic series had a kind of a magic and a feeling of sort of mystique about it. So when something from the classic series, whether it be a companion or a monster, came back, it felt incredibly exciting. Now it's hard for us to judge whether early NuWho has that same, because we've been watching NuWho from the beginning live, as it were. It's hard for us to judge if something from, say, the Christopher Eccleston era coming back has that same emotional impact for fans who've only been watching the Jodie Whittaker series live, but have gone back and watched those episodes.
I guess if you're like 20 or something and you watched that first episode when you were like 5, then maybe it does, because that's such a huge, that's a whole life. Even if 15 years isn't necessarily that long, it is if those are like a pivotal 15 years for you, I suppose.
Yeah, and if you'd started watching with the Jodie Whittaker episodes and then gone back onto Netflix or iPlayer and watched these quote-unquote sort of classic NuWho episodes, and then something like Captain Jack coming back would, I guess, feel the same to you as it did for us when Sarah Jane came back into school reunions.
Yeah. I mean, we should talk a little bit about the episode itself, because so much of it is about Sarah Jane, but it does actually have quite a good story in of itself, I think. I love Mr. Finch, Anthony Head's evil school teacher, which is such a sort of, it was a fun twist after he was Giles and Buffy, because this was pretty soon after he was Giles and Buffy. It was only about 3 years or something, so he was still pretty known for that. And I think we interviewed him a while back, and he said he was kind of anxious about doing this because it was a school again, and he was like, I've just done that. This is
I'm evil Giles.
Yeah. But then he read it and he was like, oh no, it was actually really cool. And we actually ran a poll years ago. So, I don't know if people would still feel the same way, but we asked people to rate the best Doctor Who, like one-off guest star or something very specific. And he won by a country mile, because he is just a villain of the week, essentially, but he's just so cool. Like, he's so, like, sort of snarlingly evil, but, like, so suave. And, like, he goes toe-to-toe with David Tennant brilliantly. It's at a pool, isn't it? They have that scene at the pool.
Oh, the face-off at the pool is one of the best scenes in NuWho, I think, just because they both play it so well. And it is a role, Mr. Finch, that, it's a decent enough villain, but I think in the hands of someone, of a lesser actor, someone less charismatic, it wouldn't be as well remembered as it is, because it's Anthony Head.
Yeah, and in a way, I'm sort of like, I feel like it's almost a waste having Anthony Head just be an episode in a villain in one episode. I mean, we don't see him die, I suppose, so who knows? But
fans have often said he'd make a great master or even a great Doctor.
And he auditioned, right, for the movie.
Yeah, well, he auditioned for the 1996 TV movie that ended up starring Paul McGann, so he was up for it. I think that's the only time he's officially gone up for it. But he's been, possibly because Giles in Buffy is quite a Doctor-esque character, he's often been linked to it since. So I think, any time, certainly, in years gone by, that the role was vacant or about to be vacant, his name would be thrown into the mix.
I always quite liked as well, like the episode, this is maybe a slightly odd thing to say, but the Krillitane, when watching it at the time, I didn't know Classic Who particularly well, and I assumed the Krillitane had been in Doctor Who before. Because of that throwaway reference where he says they used to look like us just with really long necks, I was like, oh, that's probably some old makeup thing where that was like, oh, they were like, oh, they can take anything. But, obviously they couldn't really show much of that in the 70s, so whatever, blah, blah. And then they all just made up, and I was like, what a weird detail to mention. But then I kind of loved that. Like, it feels quite textured, like the fact that he sort of mentions in this throwaway way that he's really familiar with the Krillitane. It's as if they're a monster that he's quite familiar with. And
I quite like that. I quite like that as well when the Doctor has met a monster before, but we haven't, because it gives you scope to imagine unseen adventures, and indeed obligatory mention Big Finish, and books and comics, the opportunity to fill in those gaps. And maybe the second Doctor met the Krillitane. Wouldn't that be fun? And you get to have a slightly unusual crossover in that way.
Yeah, and I think they're a fun villain. Like the sort of, I mean, we watch it now, and the CGI on the bats is a little, you can see the fuzzy edges a little, but they're fun. They're quite vicious. There's that great scene where they all fly at K9, and he just says, "Ignore the shooty dog thing." Yeah, because there's no point. It's just brilliantly Doctor Who, where this sort of truly epic swelling music, and K9's going to fight them off, and then they're like, "Should we just go?" Like, what are we doing? He's just spinning around shooting little lasers. But no, there's a lot to like about the episode. I really think there is. I mean, I rewatched it for this, and I was just struck by like the soundtrack's amazing. Like, there's a really great song they play when the kids are trying to crack the God code thing, and it's just this really epic, swelling music. And I was like, God, this is a great theme. This was kind of wasted again in this episode because it is a really good episode. But you're like, this is a theme for, you could use this in a series finale. But I guess that's the point, right? You have to kind of treat every episode like it's a series finale, and then they all feel really exciting.
It's got a really fun vibe, this episode as well, which doesn't happen often in Doctor Who, where the viewer joins mid-story. So we don't see the TARDIS arrive. We don't see the Doctor kind of inveigle himself within the school. We pick up with the Doctor working as a teacher with Rose as a dinner lady. Although you do see in a TARDIS-ode, something which I had forgotten even existed, that Mickey called the Doctor and Rose to the school to investigate those strange goings-on. But I think it's quite fun, if you don't know that, to kind of be thrown right into the midst of the action.
Yeah. And he sort of mentions that, doesn't he, in the story? I was reading as well. I was reading that they cut a scene where when the Doctor's questioning that kid at the beginning with all the like really hard physics questions, the kid, like, his brain shorts out and he like collapses. Yeah. And then that's referred to later on when the teacher, who's the main bat teacher, says, "Oh, Milo's failed me. You need to come in now." And then actually I can see why they cut the scene where David Tennant like injured a child. I can see why that didn't quite make it in.
That didn't quite fly. BBC One family drama Saturday night.
Yeah, not quite. We should mention as well, because this episode is obviously all about Sarah Jane. We've talked about the impact of having Sarah Jane back in the series. Because there was actually quite a touching tribute to Sarah Jane Smith and Elisabeth Sladen done recently. It was on her birthday for one of the Doctor Who lockdown watch-alongs that have been organised by Emily Cook of Doctor Who magazine fame. They did one for The Stolen Earth and Journey's End on Elisabeth Sladen's birthday, which I think may have been slightly coincidental, but maybe it was chosen. And obviously Elisabeth Sladen plays quite a large part in those episodes. And then, basically, Rusty Davies wrote Sarah Jane's funeral, which was very sweet, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. It was a kind of epilogue to the Sarah Jane adventures as a whole. And it, as you say, it took place during and in the aftermath of her funeral, because obviously Elisabeth Sladen died rather unexpectedly, and filming on the final series of the Sarah Jane Adventures had to be cut short, as did the show as a whole. So this acted as a de facto finale for the show, and the original cast all took part. So you had Daniel Anthony as Clyde, and Tommy Knight as Luke, and Anjali Mahindra as Rani. And they all filmed their own segments in lockdown. And you had returning Doctor Who stars as well, like Katie Manning as Jo Grant, who obviously previously featured in Sarah Jane Adventures, Sophie Aldred as Ace as well. And yeah, it was very touching. It was sort of quite sad, but also quite optimistic. I won't spoil it if you haven't seen it yet, though you absolutely should. But there's a slightly ambiguous, hopeful ending to it as well. Because the original Sarah Jane Adventures had it sort of ended with a montage of clips from the show, and it ended on a slightly ambiguous note, which at the time I quite liked. So again, I always seem to be concerned. I was quite concerned as to how this would play out, and would it be a slightly downbeat ending. But I think this did enough to be both sort of touching and sad, but also optimistic and hopeful.
Definitely. And it's kind of nice to see school reunion so soon after watching that, because that's kind of the beginning of Sarah Jane's NuWho journey, and that this thing is kind of maybe not the end of it exactly, but because I'm sure the character's continuing. Elisabeth Sladen's daughter's playing her in some Big Finish dramas, I think, and I'm sure the character will continue to feature in stories and comics and whatever. Like you kind of can't keep a good Doctor Who character down in that sense. But yeah, no, it's nice that Sarah Jane did get to kind of have that full story. I mean, it's also great that a show like Doctor Who can tell the story of one ordinary human person in this big sci-fi thing, and can tell it for like decades and decades, like 50, 60 years of that person's story from when they were young to coming back and doing all this stuff. It's kind of cool. Like, you don't really have that with many other TV shows, even something like Star Trek that's been around for a while. You kind of don't have the cast so keen to kind of keep telling those stories, do you?
Yeah, it's like soap operas and Doctor Who, right? Is the only shows where feasibly you can have one person play the same character 40 years later and sort of chart their whole journey, and people want to see that journey as well.
Yeah, I think it means something because Doctor Who is all about the revamp and the regeneration, and because the series lead changes constantly every 4 or 5 years or so, there's a new Doctor. having those connections to the past sort of makes it feel like more of a cohesive whole. Like bringing back, we mentioned John Barrowman, bringing back John Barrowman into the Jodie Whittaker era is, quite a cool way to sort of remind fans that, yeah, this is all the same world. In the same way that Sarah Jane coming along with the David Tennant Doctor is a way of saying, no, this is the same story. Because I know, sometimes it feels like the classic Doctor Who stories are kind of a different country, they're like a different area of Doctor Who, and it's nice to kind of be reminded, but it is all part of the same thing, and people can pop in and out, and all go to lovely funerals together. Anyway, that has been our school reunion and the later reunion of the friends and family of Sarah Jane Smith. I've been Hugh Fullerton.
I've been Morgan Jeffrey.
And thank you so much for listening to this podcast. As ever, we have loads of Doctor Who content and Sarah Jane content on radiotimes.com, and we'll have another podcast for you same time-ish next week. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.